My children thought I was an old woman living in a museum of memories. They were right about the memories, but they were wrong about the old woman. They thought I was too frail to fight back when they forged my name to steal my home. They were about to learn that the deepest roots are the hardest to pull, and that a mother's love, when betrayed, can become the most patient and unforgiving force on this earth. If you believe that justice isn't always found in a courtroom, but sometimes in the quiet, calculated moves we make when we've been pushed too far, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because this is a story about a debt that wasn't paid with money, but with a lifetime of humility. Part 1. The Yellow House on Maple Street. The story begins, as so many do, in a house. Not a grand house, not a mansion you'd see in a magazine, but a small two-bedroom home painted a cheerful shade of yellow. Or, it used to be cheerful. Lately, the color felt a little tired, a little faded, much like the woman who lived inside it. That woman was me, Helen. I was 65 years old, a widow for 5, and a resident of 124 Maple Street for 43 years. This house was the only real partner I had left. My husband, Robert, and I had bought it with calloused hands and hopeful hearts. Every dollar was earned through his grueling shifts at the steel factory, the smell of metal and sweat clinging to him when he came home, and my own long hours as a registered nurse, my shoes squeaking on sterile hospital floors. We poured our youth into its foundation, our laughter into its walls, our dreams into the garden out back. I could still see Robert everywhere. His worn-out armchair in the corner of the living room held the permanent impression of his body. The faint, sweet scent of his pipe tobacco still clung to the floral curtains he'd begrudgingly agreed to let me hang. In the hallway, a series of pencil marks climbed the doorframe, little ticks and dates charting the growth of our 2 children, Mark and Jessica. Mark 4 feet, 1990. Jessica, 3 feet 6 inches, 1992. Those marks were more sacred to me than any scripture. This house wasn't just wood and plaster, it was a living scrapbook of my entire existence. It was the floorboards I'd paced at 3 a.m. with a colicky infant in my arms. It was the kitchen where I'd baked 17 disastrous birthday cakes and 1 perfect one. It was the backyard where I'd kissed my children's scraped knees and watched Robert teach them how to throw a baseball. I had planned to live out the rest of my days here, surrounded by the gentle ghosts of a life well lived, watering my roses and drinking my tea on the porch. My children, however, had drafted a different floor plan for my future. It started subtly, like the first chill of autumn in the air. A suggestion dropped into a conversation like a cube of sugar into tea, meant to sweeten a bitter pill. Mark, my son, was the first. He was a man who saw the world as a series of balance sheets. Practical, he called himself. Cold, I called him in the privacy of my own mind. He and his wife, Brenda, came for Sunday dinner, their visits growing noticeably more frequent. "You know, Mom," he said one evening, swirling the wine in his glass and surveying my living room with a critical eye. "This is a lot of house for one person." I smiled, a thin, polite stretch of my lips. "I manage." "But do you need to?" Brenda chimed in, her voice always a little too bright, a little too sharp. "Think of the upkeep. The cleaning. You should be relaxing, enjoying your retirement, not worrying about mowing the lawn." "The lawn gives me purpose," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "And my roses." Jessica, my daughter, tried a different tactic a few days later over the phone. She was the emotional one, the one who had always known how to weaponize her tears. "I was just thinking about you all alone in that big place, Mommy," she'd said, her voice laced with a practiced, breathy concern. "It must get so lonely. Wouldn't a nice, modern condo be better? A community with other people your age? They have bingo nights." I hated bingo. "I'm not lonely, dear," I told her. "I have my books. And my memories." But they were persistent. The casual comments became a steady drizzle, then a downpour. It was a coordinated attack disguised as loving concern. Mark talked about the hot sellers market and unlocking the equity in my home. He used phrases like financial strategy and asset reallocation, as if my life was a corporate merger to be negotiated. Jessica spoke of her own struggles. Her husband, Tom, was struggling to get his landscaping business off the ground. Their children, my grandchildren, needed braces and tuition for private school. The money from the sale could help us all so much, Mom, she'd said, her voice thick with meaning. It would be a gift that helps the whole family. You'd be taking care of us, even now. Taking care of them. As if I hadn't spent my entire life doing just that. They saw my home not as the sanctuary it was, but as a piggy bank they were ready to smash open. The final, brutal conversation happened on a Sunday in May. The scent of my blooming roses drifted through the open windows. They had cornered me in my own kitchen, a united front of entitlement. Mom, we've talked about this, Mark began, crossing his arms. He had his father's height but none of his warmth. It's time to be realistic. This house is worth nearly $500,000 in this market. That's life-changing money. For who, Mark? I asked quietly, my hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. The porcelain was cool against my skin. For me or for you? Jessica stepped forward, her face a mask of wounded sincerity. How can you even say that? Of course it's for you. But you could help us with some of it. We're your family. We're struggling. Mark's construction company is barely breaking even, and Tom and I are drowning in debt. Is it so wrong to want your mother's help? Your father and I worked our entire lives for this house, I said, my voice trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from a rage that was beginning to smolder in my chest. We saved every penny. We did without so that you too could have more. This home is my security. It's all I have left of him. It is not a line of credit for your poor financial decisions. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Mark's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. Jessica's eyes welled up with performative tears. I knew it, she whispered, turning away dramatically. She doesn't care about us. She cares more about this old house than her own children. They left without another word. The screen door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing the slamming of a door in my heart. I sank into a kitchen chair, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The smell of the roses suddenly seemed sickly sweet. They saw me as an obstacle. A dragon sitting on a hoard of gold that they believed was rightfully theirs. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through the quiet rooms, trailing my hand along the furniture, touching the photographs on the mantel. I felt a profound sense of dread, a premonition that this was far from over. I was right. 3 weeks later, the phone rang. It was a man with a brisk, cheerful voice. Hello, is this Helen Miller? It is, I answered. Hi there, this is David Campbell from Summit Realty. I'm just calling to confirm our appointment for tomorrow at 10 a.m. to take the professional photos. We're excited to get your property listed. It's a prime time to sell on Maple Street. The world tilted on its axis. My hand tightened on the receiver, my knuckles turning white. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I think you have the wrong number, I stammered. My house isn't for sale. There was a pause, the sound of shuffling papers. It says here 124 Maple Street. Listing agreement signed by Helen Miller. We received the paperwork from your son, Mark Miller, last week. He's handling the arrangements, right? My breath caught in my throat. It felt like a shard of ice had pierced my chest. He's handling the arrangements. The audacity. The sheer, gut-wrenching betrayal. There's been a mistake, I said, my voice a hollow whisper, and hung up the phone. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in my own kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. A bird chirped outside the window. The ordinary sounds of a world that had suddenly become alien and hostile. Then, a cold clarity washed over me. I grabbed my purse and my car keys. I drove to the county clerk's office, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The building was a cold, impersonal place of beige walls and fluorescent lights. I gave the clerk my address, my heart hammering against my ribs. She tapped on her computer for a moment, then disappeared into a back room. She returned with a file. Here you go, she said, sliding a sheaf of papers across the counter. And there it was. A property listing agreement. A seller's disclosure. Page after page of legal documents, all detailing the impending sale of my home. And at the bottom of each page, a signature. My signature. Or a clumsy, arrogant imitation of it. The looping H was too sharp, the tail of the N too long. It was a crude forgery, a child's attempt at copying their parents' handwriting. But it was close enough to pass a cursory glance. I stood there, under the humming fluorescent lights, and felt the last 43 years of my life crumble into dust. They hadn't just tried to sell my house. They had tried to erase me. They had taken my name, my identity, and signed it away as if it were nothing. The hurt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. It was a deeper wound than anything I had ever treated in my nursing career. But beneath the hurt, beneath the shock, that smoldering ember of rage began to glow. They had made a critical miscalculation. They had mistaken my age for weakness. They had confused my quiet life for a passive one. They had forgotten who I was. I was the daughter of a coal miner who taught me to be resilient. I was the wife of a factory worker who taught me to be patient. I was a nurse who had looked death in the eye and had never, ever flinched. I didn't go home and cry. I didn't call them and scream. That's what they would have expected. Instead, I drove to the office of Arthur Abernathy, the lawyer who had handled our will and had been Robert's friend since childhood. He was old, semi-retired, and his office was filled with dusty law books and the smell of old paper. I laid the papers on his desk. He put on his reading glasses, his bushy white eyebrows knitting together as he read. He looked up at me, his kind eyes filled with a furious fire on my behalf. "The little vultures," he breathed, his voice a low growl. "Helen, this is forgery. It's a felony." "I know," I said, my voice steady for the first time all day. "I don't want to send them to jail, Arthur. I just want to make it stop. Quietly." He nodded, a grim understanding on his face. "We can do that. A cease and desist to the realtor. A notarized affidavit from you testifying to the forgery. We can shut this down so fast their heads will spin. They'll never know how close they came to a prison cell." He did exactly that. Within 48 hours, the sale was dead. The listing was pulled. The realty company, terrified of a lawsuit, expunged it from their records. It was as if it had never happened. And I said nothing. I went home to my little yellow house. I answered their calls. Mark asked if I was feeling all right. Jessica asked if I needed anything. Their voices were laced with a fake, cloying sweetness that made my stomach turn. They were probing, trying to see if I suspected anything. "I'm fine, dears," I would say, my voice as calm and placid as a summer lake. "Just pottering around the garden." They thought my silence was acquiescence. They assumed their plan had simply hit a bureaucratic snag and they would try again later. They had no idea that I was standing in the rubble of our family, not as a victim, but as a survivor who was quietly gathering stones. They thought the battle was just beginning. They didn't realize I had already won the first campaign. And that I was now planning a war. Part 2. The cracks in the facade. The weeks that followed the quiet cancellation of my home's fraudulent sale were a masterclass in deception, both theirs and mine. My children operated under the mistaken belief that their scheme had simply been delayed. They treated me with a new, suffocating kind of solicitude. Mark would call, his voice booming with false cheer, to ask if I'd thought any more about the benefits of downsizing. Jessica would drop by with lukewarm casseroles and my grandchildren, using the kids as a shield, all the while her eyes scanned my house as if she were taking inventory of assets. They were circling, waiting for another opportunity to strike. And I, in turn, built a fortress of feigned ignorance around myself. I played the part of the slightly dotty, sentimental old woman they believed me to be. When they brought up the house, I would change the subject with a meandering story about their father or a complaint about the aphids on my roses. I allowed a gentle fog of forgetfulness to settle around me, a perfect camouflage. "Oh, that realtor who called?" I'd say with a confused frown when Mark pressed me. "I don't rightly remember, dear. So many telemarketers these days." The look of frustration on his face was a small, bitter reward. It was the first time in my life I had ever derived pleasure from my children's annoyance, and the feeling was both intoxicating and deeply unsettling. This was the new reality they had created. A chess match where only one player knew the board. But while I maintained my serene exterior, The nights were a different story. Sleep offered no escape. I would lie awake for hours, the silence of the house amplifying the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. The betrayal was a living thing, a parasite that fed on my memories. I would look at the family portraits on my nightstand, Mark as a gap-toothed little leaguer, Jessica in her frilly Easter dress, and I would feel a grief so profound it was a physical ache. I was mourning the loss of my children, not to death, but to something far uglier, greed. I started talking to Robert. I'd sit in his armchair, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in my hands, and I would speak to his photograph on the mantel. They tried to sell our home, Bobby, I'd whisper into the quiet room. Our home. The one you reshingled yourself that summer it was 100 degrees. The one where we brought our babies home from the hospital. They tried to sell it for what? A new car? A bigger television? I don't understand. I don't understand the people they've become. The photograph would just stare back, his familiar, kind smile frozen in time. But in those one-sided conversations, I found a measure of strength. I was not just defending a house, I was defending our life, our legacy. My resolve hardened from a shield into a weapon. And then, the universe began to serve its own brand of justice. The first cracks in my children's carefully constructed lives began to appear, and I was there to watch, a silent observer in the front row. Mark's downfall came first. His construction company, Miller & Sons Quality Homes, was built on a foundation as shoddy as his own character. He prized speed over quality, profit over integrity. He'd been underbidding on contracts for years, cutting corners on materials, using non-union labor. I learned this not from him, of course, but from whispers on the wind. From Carol, my friend from the nursing auxiliary, whose nephew had been one of Mark's underpaid roofers. From the local newspaper, which I started reading with a forensic intensity. The lawsuit was devastating. A family had bought one of Mark's new builds in a fancy subdivision. 6 months later, during a heavy rainstorm, the basement flooded, and a structural engineer discovered the foundation had been improperly poured and sealed. The whole house was compromised. The story was on the front page of the local section. I sat at my kitchen table, the newspaper spread before me, and read every word. The article quoted the homeowners, their anguish palpable. "We put our life savings into this home," the wife had said. I felt a pang of sympathy for them, and a cold, grim satisfaction directed at my son. He had tried to steal the foundation from under my feet, and now his own were crumbling into sand. Mark's arrogance and bluster were no match for discovery motions and expert testimony. He was forced to settle, a figure that the paper reported was in the high 6 figures. It wiped him out. His company folded, his business assets were seized, and the gleaming new pickup truck with his company logo was repossessed. He and Brenda had to put their oversized, ostentatious house on the market, a desperate attempt to stay afloat. Jessica's ruin was a quieter, more insidious affair. It wasn't a single, spectacular explosion, but a slow, suffocating drowning in debt. She and Tom lived a life they couldn't afford, a performance for an audience that wasn't paying attention. Their house in the suburbs was mortgaged to the hilt. Their 2 new SUVs were on expensive leases. Their children were dressed in designer clothes. Their Instagram feeds a curated fantasy of perfect family vacations and happy-go-lucky consumerism. I saw the truth one afternoon when I dropped by unannounced with a jar of my homemade jam, a gesture to maintain my cover. I walked in through the unlocked back door and heard Jessica in the kitchen, her back to me. Her voice wasn't the sweet, cooing tone she used with me. It was shrill, panicked, and ugly. "What do you mean the payment was declined?" she shrieked into her phone. "Try it again." "No, I don't have another card to put it on. They're all. Just run it again." She slammed the phone down, her hands shaking as she gripped the polished granite countertop. She saw me then, and her face went through a rapid series of transformations, from raw panic to shock, then to a forced, sickly smile. "Mom. You startled me," she said, her voice trembling. Just a silly mix-up with the bank." I just smiled my gentle, vacant smile. "Oh dear. Well, I brought you some strawberry jam." I placed the jar on the counter, a homespun offering in a temple of debt. As I drove home, I knew. They were a house of cards in a windstorm. It was only a matter of time. Their desperation made them reckless. With their own worlds collapsing, the perceived value of my little yellow house grew exponentially in their minds. It was no longer a bonus, it was a lifeline. They decided it was time for an intervention. They showed up together one evening, unannounced. They didn't bring a casserole or grandchildren this time. They brought their desperation, and it filled my small living room like a toxic gas. "Mom, we need to talk," Mark said, foregoing any pleasantries. He looked haggard, his usually immaculate hair was unkempt, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Jessica stood beside him, her arms crossed, her face pale and drawn. The performance was over. This was raw, naked need. They sat me down on my own sofa, the one Robert and I had picked out together 40 years ago. They stood over me, a united front of failure. "My company is gone, Mom," Mark said, his voice flat. "Brenda and I are going to have to declare bankruptcy. We're losing the house." "And we're next," Jessica choked out, actual tears streaming down her face this time. "The bank sent a notice. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage. They're starting foreclosure proceedings. We're going to be homeless, Mom. Your grandchildren are going to be homeless." They let the words hang in the air, a blatant, desperate attempt at emotional blackmail. I was supposed to crumble. I was supposed to weep and wring my hands and offer up my home, my security, my entire life, on the altar of their mistakes. I looked from my son's desperate face to my daughter's tear-streaked one. I saw no remorse for what they had tried to do to me. I saw only 2 people who had driven their own cars off a cliff and were now demanding I hand over the keys to mine. I took a deep breath, the air in the room feeling thick and heavy. I looked at the pencil marks on the doorframe in the hall. I thought of the forged signature on the listing agreement. And I said, no. It was just one word. Quiet. Calm. Final. They stared at me, stunned into silence. "What?" Mark finally sputtered. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no," I repeated, my voice gaining strength. I stood up, so I was no longer looking up at them. "Your financial problems are the result of your own choices. You built a business on cutting corners, Mark. You bought a life you couldn't afford, Jessica. You have made your beds. I will not allow you to burn down my house to stay warm in them." The shock on their faces curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. "I can't believe you," Jessica shrieked, her voice cracking. "You selfish, horrible old woman. We're your children. How can you be so cruel?" "Cruel?" I asked, and a genuine cold laugh escaped my lips. It was a sound I'd never made before. "You want to talk about cruelty? You have no idea." They stormed out, slamming the front door so hard that a photograph on the wall rattled in its frame. It was a picture of the 4 of us at the Grand Canyon years ago. A happy family. A lie. I watched their car screech away from the curb, leaving black tire marks on the quiet pavement of Maple Street. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The lines had been drawn. They had shown me their true selves, and I had shown them only a fraction of mine. A week later, a bright red "for sale" sign was pounded into Jessica's perfectly manicured lawn. A few weeks after that, a similar sign appeared on Mark's. They weren't sales by choice. They were fire sales, managed by the banks that now owned their futures. They called me cruel. They called me selfish. They had yet to understand the depths of what I was truly capable of. They had planted the seeds of their own destruction with their greed and lies. All I had to do now was wait for the harvest. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very bones, that I would be the one holding the scythe. Part 3. The Landlord in Waiting. The weeks that followed the disastrous intervention were marked by a profound and telling silence. My children, having played their final, desperate card and lost, retreated into a cocoon of bitter resentment. The phone calls stopped. The token visits ceased. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone, and yet, I did not feel lonely. I felt focused. The pain of their betrayal had crystallized into a singular, cold purpose. I was no longer a grieving mother, I was an investor watching the market, waiting for the perfect moment to buy. My days took on a new rhythm. I was no longer just Helen Miller, the retired nurse. I became a student. I spent hours at the library, not in the fiction aisles, but in the finance section. I read books on real estate, on foreclosure law, on public auctions. The librarians, who knew me as the sweet old lady who always borrowed cozy mysteries, now saw me poring over dense legal texts, a yellow highlighter in my hand. I learned the language of liens, deeds, and writs of execution. I was arming myself with knowledge, the most powerful weapon in my arsenal. I also became a spy, of sorts. My age and perceived frailty were the perfect disguise. No one pays much attention to an old woman in a sensible cardigan. I take long walks, my route just so happening to take me past Jessica's house. I saw the progression of their collapse firsthand. The lawn that Tom, the professional landscaper, had once kept like a golf course, grew shaggy and weed-choked. An official-looking notice, stark white against the dark green of their front door, was taped to the wood. I didn't need to read it to know what it was. I gathered intelligence in other, more subtle ways. At the grocery store, I'd make small talk with a neighbor who lived down the street from Mark and Brenda. With a few gentle, prodding questions disguised as idle chatter, I learned that Brenda had taken the kids and moved back in with her mother. That Mark was living in the house alone, drinking too much, the blinds always drawn. The community grapevine, once a source of harmless gossip, was now my personal intelligence network. The most crucial step, however, took place not in the library or on the street, but in a sleek, modern office downtown. I made an appointment with my financial advisor, a sharp young woman named Sarah who had always treated me with a sort of patient condescension, as if I were a child who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of my own portfolio. This time, the meeting was different. I didn't come with questions about my dividend statements. I came with a plan. I sat across from her at her glass-top desk and laid it all out. I need to liquidate a portion of my municipal bond portfolio, I said, my voice clear and steady. I also want to sell my shares in the Technology Index Fund. I need the cash available within the next 30 days. I will require 2 separate cashier's checks. Sarah blinked, taken aback by my decisiveness. Helen, that's a significant portion of your holdings. It's a very aggressive move. May I ask what this is for? A big trip, perhaps? It's for an investment, I said simply. In real estate. She looked at me, her professional skepticism warring with her surprise. But she saw something new in my eyes, a flinty resolve she'd never encountered before. She typed furiously into her computer, her brow furrowed. The total amount would be, she paused, her eyes widening slightly as she looked at the number on her screen. Well, it would be quite substantial. I know, I said. Get it done. As I walked out of that office building and into the bright sunlight, I felt a surge of power I hadn't felt in years. The money Robert and I had so carefully saved, the nest egg meant to provide for a peaceful and quiet old age, was about to be repurposed. It was no longer a cushion, it was ammunition. But even with my plan in motion, there were moments of doubt. They crept in during the quiet hours of the night, ghosts of the mother I used to be. One evening, I was sorting through an old box of photographs and found a picture of Mark and Jessica as toddlers, sitting in a little red wagon in our backyard. Their faces were bright with innocent joy, their arms slung around each other. A wave of profound sorrow washed over me. How had those 2 children become the bitter, grasping adults who had tried to steal from me? Could I truly go through with this? Was I becoming as cold and calculating as they were? I held the photograph in my hand, my thumb stroking the faded image of Jessica's chubby cheek. Then, my eyes drifted to the small mahogany box on my desk where I kept my important papers. Inside, nestled between my birth certificate and my marriage license, was the copy of the forged listing agreement Arthur Abernathy had given me. I opened the box and took out the paper. I looked at the crude forgery of my name. I remembered the cold dread in the county clerk's office. I remembered the sound of their voices in my living room, dripping with accusation and entitlement. My resolve hardened like steel. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about a lesson. A lesson in consequences. A lesson they should have learned 40 years ago in that very backyard. I put the photograph away. The woman who had raised those children was gone. The woman who was about to become their landlord had taken her place. The day of the first auction dawned gray and overcast. It was Jessica and Tom's house. The auction was to be held, as was the custom, on the steps of the county courthouse. I dressed carefully, choosing a plain gray coat, a simple headscarf, and a pair of large sunglasses. I wanted to be anonymous, a ghost in the crowd. In my purse, nestled next to my wallet, was the first cashier's check. Its weight was both a burden and a comfort. The crowd on the courthouse steps was a motley crew. There were slick-looking men in suits, clearly professional investors, whispering into their phones. There were young couples, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and anxiety, dreaming of getting a family home for a bargain. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my posture stooped slightly, doing my best to look like a curious old woman who had simply stumbled upon the proceedings. The auctioneer began, his voice a rapid-fire torrent of legal descriptions and bidding increments. The numbers climbed quickly. 20,000. 50,000. 100. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the auctioneer's staccato rhythm. I stayed silent, letting the sharks feed. The price rose and rose, slowing as it neared the property's market value. The young couples dropped out, their faces falling in disappointment. It came down to two of the suited investors, bidding against each other in crisp, $5,000 increments. Finally, one of them shook his head. The auctioneer's gaze swept the crowd. $285,000. Going once. Going twice. This was it. My moment. I took a half-step forward, my voice clear and louder than I expected. 290,000. Every head turned to look at me. The investors stared, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Who was this old woman? The auctioneer's eyes found mine. He grinned, sensing a new player. We have 290,000 from the lady in the gray coat. Do I hear 300? The remaining investor hesitated, then gave a sharp, frustrated shake of his head. He was out. 290,000. Going once. Going twice. Sold. The crack of his gavel was like a gunshot. To the lady in the gray coat. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I had done it. I had just purchased my daughter's home. An official directed me inside to sign the paperwork and hand over the check. My hand was perfectly steady as I signed my name, my real name in my own true hand. 2 weeks later, I did it again. Mark's house. The crowd was smaller this time, the property less desirable without Brenda's decorating flair. The process was the same. I waited. I watched. And at the last possible moment, I placed my winning bid. The second gavel fell. It was done. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table in my little yellow house. The streetlights of Maple Street cast a warm glow through the window. In front of me, laid out like trophies, were the preliminary deeds to both of my children's homes. My homes, now. I had spent my life providing them with a roof over their heads. And now, I would do so again. But this time, it would be on my terms. The phone rang, its shrill cry cutting through the quiet of the house. I looked at the caller ID. It was Jessica. Of course, it was Jessica. The bank would have notified her today. The final nail had been hammered into the coffin of her financial life. I let it ring one more time, savoring the moment. Then, with a slow, steady hand, I picked up the receiver. My heart wasn't pounding anymore. It was beating with a slow, calm, and deliberate rhythm. "Hello, Jessica," I said. The first domino was teetering on the edge. And I was about to give it a firm, decisive push. Part 4, the first of the month. Jessica's voice on the other end of the line was a ragged, shredded thing. It was the sound of a person who had been hollowed out by panic. "Mom," she sobbed, her words punctuated by desperate, gasping breaths. "Mom, it's gone. The house is gone. The bank called. They sold it at auction today. We got the official notice. We have 30 days to get out. 30 days. I don't know what to do. We have nowhere to go. Tom is a wreck. The kids." She trailed off into a fit of weeping. I listened patiently, my expression unreadable, my silence a vast, empty space for her to pour her despair into. I let her cry for a full minute, the sound of her anguish as strange and terrible music in my quiet kitchen. In the past, this sound would have shattered my heart. I would have been on my way over with promises of help, with my checkbook open, ready to fix her life as I had done so many times before. But that woman was gone. The forgery had killed her. When her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths, I finally spoke. My voice was gentle, almost serene. There was no trace of triumph, no hint of malice. Just a simple, devastating statement of fact. "Yes, Jessica," I said calmly. "I know they sold it." There was a pause. You know." She stammered, confused. "Yes," I said, taking a slow sip of my tea. "I know. Because I was the one who bought it." The silence that followed was the most profound I have ever heard. It was not just an absence of sound. It was an absence of everything. I could almost hear the frantic clicking of her mind as it struggled to process what I had said, trying to fit it into a reality where it simply did not belong. It was the sound of a worldview being irrevocably shattered. "What?" she finally whispered. The word was small, fragile, like a piece of glass. That's not funny, Mom." "I'm not laughing, Jessica," I replied, my voice still unervingly calm. You what? You bought my house." Her voice climbed an octave, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "Why? Why would you do that?" I thought of a dozen things I could say. "Because you tried to steal mine. Because you are entitled and spoiled. Because you broke my heart." But I didn't. I gave her something much colder, much cleaner. "Because it was for sale," I said. And then I hung up. I knew she would call Mark. The news would travel like wildfire. I didn't have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, a car screeched to a halt in my driveway. My front door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, rattling the picture frames. Mark stood in the doorway, his face a mottled, terrifying shade of red. He looked like a man about to have a stroke. "What did you do?" he bellowed, storming into my living room. He was a whirlwind of rage, his presence sucking all the air out of the small space. "Jessica called me hysterical. She said you bought her house. Is it true? Is it true?" I didn't flinch. I remained seated at my kitchen table, turning to look at him over the back of my chair. "Yes, Mark. It's true. I bought her house this morning. And I bought yours 2 weeks ago." He stared at me, his mouth hanging open, his chest heaving. He looked from me to the 2 deeds laid out on the table. The color drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, sickly white. You can't," he stammered. "How could you? We're your children. We're your family." That was the moment. The culmination of months of pain, of silent planning, of cold fury. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate. I walked to my desk and retrieved the mahogany box. I opened it and took out the copy of the forged listing agreement. I walked back to the kitchen table and slid the paper across the polished wood toward him. It stopped right in front of him. "Let's talk about family, Mark," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Is this what family does? Does a son forge his mother's name? Does he try to sell the roof over her head, the home his father worked himself into an early grave to pay for?" He looked down at the paper. He saw the clumsy imitation of my signature. Recognition, and then a wave of pure, undiluted shame, washed over his features. For the first time, he had no words. He was caught. "You didn't see me as your mother," I continued, my voice as sharp and cold as a surgeon's scalpel. "You saw me as a problem to be managed. An asset to be liquidated. You stood in this very room and called me selfish and cruel because I wouldn't bail you out of the messes you made for yourselves. You thought I was old. You thought I was weak. You thought I was stupid. You were wrong." He finally looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "Mom. We were desperate." "You were greedy," I corrected him. "And now you will learn a lesson in value. You'll learn what it truly costs to keep a roof over your head. I am not giving you the houses." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "I am, however," I went on, "offering you a lease. Both of you. You can stay in your homes. You can keep your children in their schools. But you will be my tenants. You will pay me rent. Fair market value. It will be due on the 1st of every month, without fail. You will sign a legally binding contract, and you will learn what it feels like to have your security in someone else's hands. He sank into a chair, his big frame seeming to collapse in on itself. He buried his face in his hands. The fight was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of his defeat. He, the big-shot businessman, the master of his own universe, was about to become a tenant in his own home, beholden to the mother he had tried to discard. And so it began. The lawyers drew up the leases. Mark and Jessica, with their credit ruined and with no other options, signed them. The 1st of the month became a new, solemn holiday in our fractured family. Jessica was the first to arrive. She wouldn't come inside. She stood on the porch, her eyes fixed on my rose bushes, and handed me a sealed envelope. She couldn't look at me. "Here's the rent," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. I took the check, her hand recoiling from mine as if I were white-hot iron. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and closed the door. Mark came later that evening. He was defiant, sullen. He strode up to the door and slapped the check into my hand. "There," he grunted, his jaw tight. He tried to stare me down, to find some flicker of the old, soft mother he could manipulate. He found none. He found only the cool, appraising gaze of his landlord. He turned and walked away without another word. The story, as stories do in small towns, got out. The neighbors whispered as they collected their mail. Mrs. Gable from across the street, who had watched my children grow up, saw me watering my roses one afternoon. She didn't offer pity or condemnation. She just gave me a long, slow nod. It was a nod of understanding, of respect. A silent acknowledgement between two women of a certain generation who understood that sometimes, you have to fight for what's yours. My life is quiet now. The screaming rage has subsided, replaced by a tranquil, peaceful solitude. I live in my little yellow house, surrounded by the ghosts I choose. My children still live in their big, suburban homes. My homes. Our relationship is now purely transactional. They are my tenants. I am their landlord. They don't call me Mom anymore. Sometimes, when I'm in my garden, trimming the dead heads off my rose bushes, I think about the nature of justice. It is not always swift or loud. Sometimes, it is slow, patient, and meticulous. Sometimes, justice is a cashier's check in an old woman's purse. Sometimes, it's the sound of a gavel falling in a quiet courthouse. And sometimes, it's the sight of your children, the very people who tried to cast you out, having to hand you a check every single month for the privilege of staying in the life they almost lost. They called me old and helpless. But in the end, I was the one holding all the keys. And my roses, watered in peace and security, have never, ever bloomed brighter. The strongest foundations are the ones we refuse to let others break. If you've ever had to stand your ground and fight for what's yours, let us know in the comments below. Your story matters. And if you're not already subscribed, make sure you do, so you never miss a story of justice, served cold. We'll see you next time.